So, Dr. Malvesti will do the introductions of the panel, but I'll just say I'm going to introduce her. Michelle Malvesti is a longtime friend and a former colleague of mine from the National Security Council staff. Had a very distinguished government career, finishing as Senior Director for Combating Terrorism on the NSC staff under President Bush, former President Bush. Then she has transitioned into a distinguished academic career, taught at Yale for a number of years, now is teaching at the Fletcher School in Boston, and decided she wanted to come enjoy some of this beautiful Austin weather we have. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and she'll introduce the panelists.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I just do want to acknowledge here just the leadership of Will, of Bobby Chesney, of Steve Slick, and of course of Chancellor McRaven in terms of really pulling together a community of practice and thought leadership on national security and intelligence issues. I think the students here in the audience, other faculty members, quite frankly, the broader UT and Austin community, you truly are the beneficiaries of very distinguished individuals who have deep domain expertise on intelligence and national security. And so in many ways, I'm a bit envious of you from where I was starting out my career 25 years ago. So I did want to acknowledge that. It's a pleasure to share the stage here with gentlemen who've been dealing with these issues for multiple decades. Immediately now to my left is John McLaughlin, who is the former acting director of Central Intelligence. His career in the agency spanned over 3 decades. I will leave it to you to look at his bio for more details, but I did want to highlight one particular nugget, in that he did found the Sherman Kent School for Intelligence Analysis, Sherman Kent being the father of modern intelligence. And I think we'll probably draw on some of his lessons learned in that in terms of developing expertise in intelligence as we progress throughout the conversation today. In the middle here is Mr. Norm Rule. Norm, also a veteran of the agency with a career of over 34 years, spent primarily with a focus within the Middle East and on operational activities. His last position was was the National Intelligence Manager for Iran. And then here at the end of the panel is Mr. Nick Rasmussen. Mr. Nick Rasmussen just left government after 26 years in service. His last position was as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He did not begin his career, however, in the intelligence community. He, about 27 years ago, was focusing more pointedly on the policy side. So he has certainly transitioned throughout his career of being not just an individual who is briefing and working in service to policymakers, but having sat on the other side of the table, of course, receiving intelligence briefing and helping to inform our policy formulation process. I want to spend a little bit of time baselining on what we mean about competence. So the title of our panel is competence. And Steve Slick gave us a little bit of gut. We are in favor of competence. I think if I have to give the bottom line up front, we could probably say that we'll agree that it's good and it's necessary. But Steve gave us a little bit of some guidance on this. Essentially it's focusing on competence and the questions that the intelligence community cannot afford to get wrong. I'd like to expand upon that a little bit and look at competence along at least 3 vectors. Competence in the intelligence community in terms of providing long-term foundational expertise and knowledge, competence in preventing strategic surprise, and finally, competence in terms of assisting and supporting the national security decision-making process. This gets back to what John had said, asked a question in the first panel, and noted that one of the key elements of intelligence is to give decision-makers a decision advantage. And I think we'll explore that as we continue on with the panel. In terms of ensuring competence, or effectively making sure that we get the questions right, we also get the answers right, is underlying that is is the importance of making sure that our intelligence community leaders who operate in a resource-constrained environment are making the right choices and the hard choices on priority issues, priorities in terms of investments in technologies, the right priorities and investments on collection disciplines and organizational structures, as well as intellectual and human capital. And so all of those elements will certainly come together as we discuss competence. I'd like to pose the first question. I'm going to pose it first to John, but I think it's important to pivot off of the last question I think that was asked from the conversation with Director Coates, but providing a little historical perspective. Let's get a little bit of a historical sweep in terms of the intelligence challenges that the IC faces today. In what ways are they, if they are, qualitatively different from what the intelligence community may have faced in previous eras, previous decades, and also lessons learned from ensuring or in developing competence during those time periods to be able to address those challenges. And so we'll start with you, Director.
Well, we could approach that in a dozen different ways, and we just talked about it a moment ago, and I think the way I would approach it, for starters, would be to look at it in terms of chronology, just to do it that way. Now, I was not in World War II. All right, let's make that clear right up front.
Too old for the draft?
Yeah, too old for the draft, yeah. But, I tend to think of that issue in a chronological way, actually going back to World War II. The emergence of a national intelligence effort in the United States coincided with the fact that World War II ended, and the experience of it itself drove home for the United States that it had global responsibilities. We didn't really feel that way uniformly before World War II. I'm reading a biography of FDR now. Look at the 30s. We didn't feel that way. After World War II, the CIA is created, and we then face, let's say, 45, 46 years of what was the Cold War. And that was a challenge where we had to deal with a range of existential issues and in a global struggle that involved ideology, technology, and everything else. And we won, basically. That rival went away. And so in 1991, when the Soviet Union falls, the intelligence challenge changes pretty dramatically. But at the same time, and the reason I'm doing it this way is because intelligence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It only exists to help the decision maker with decision advantage. If you are not actually supporting our policymakers as they try and navigate in a difficult world, there's no point in doing this. So you go into that period after the end of the Cold War, and we really have pretty much, as a nation, a kind of free path for about 17 years. We are the superpower without interruption until, I would say, 2008 and the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. When the world starts to change and when our model is doubted somewhat, and when powers that were not particularly powerful when the Soviet Union collapsed have risen. The Soviet Union is gone, but Russia is back. China is rising. And from 2008 forward to today, we face a much more complex world as a country in foreign policy. So the challenges for intelligence after World War II, get organized and figure out what your job is and combat the Soviet Union. And then the challenges are to help basically a superpower make its way in the world. And now we're in a much more competitive environment in which we need foundational intelligence, we need agility, we need expertise. One other way to think about this is to compare it with the Cold War. Okay? Let's just say Cold War and now. Cold War, we could organize ourselves by looking through the Soviet prism. And if you were interested in Latin America, it was probably because you were trying to checkmate the Soviet Union there. Africa, the same way. Today, that's gone, and we have to be interested in all of those places for what they are in and of themselves, down to the municipal level, often in great granular detail. Cold War, we had to look for really big things in the world. Deployed nuclear forces, bombers, submarines, motorized rifle division on the German border. You still have to look for all that, but now you have to look for little things too. A bomb in a suitcase, one individual in a city of 17 million, a single packet of data moving through the global information network, little things. Okay? Secrets. Cold War, they were mostly held by a small group of people, and you could meet some of them at cocktail parties. Today, not so much. Secrets you want are probably buried somewhere in Syria or on the Afghan-Pak border or deep inside the Soviet or the Russian, the Chinese Politburo. And sharing, back then we didn't have to share very much, but today you have to share this information from the local law enforcement level all the way up to the senior strategic level. So the challenge for intelligence today is dramatically different than it was when we were created, and more complex and more granular. That's how I would think about it.
Thank you for that, John. Let's expand upon this, and I'm going to turn right now to Norm. The challenges today are dramatically different across an array of issues that John just outlined. We're living in a world, for example, where there are simultaneously so many regions that are unstable, with the potential to lead to the outbreak of war. What level of effort should the intelligence community be trying to dedicate in terms of identifying the next hotspot, in terms of predicting the next Arab Spring, the next outbreak that amplifies the type of diverse challenges that John just laid out?
Well, I think it's very difficult to design an architecture which predicts an Arab Spring precisely. If you were to say, identify the list of those conditions in the Middle East which existed prior to the Arab Spring, you would find that most exist today. The unrest that took place in Iran and the conditions behind that earlier this year was identical to the unrest and the conditions that took place in Tunisia simultaneously. And you have protests routinely where vegetable salesmen have been killed, but it hasn't produced that change. At the same time, you have dramatic conflicts which don't receive a lot of attention. The Congo, for example. You have a vast nation, very mineral-rich, with 8 or 9 neighbors that are biting pieces of it away, and several million people have been consumed in that tragedy. It's easy to say that Venezuela is facing an economic collapse, but will that produce the type of anarchy that becomes regional? It's difficult to say. Crowd intent is always very hard. What the IC should do, can do, and actually does a pretty good job in doing is to say, these conditions exist, this could happen, and if it did, you would have these sorts of choices.
Okay. So let's take that another step further when you're dealing with perhaps allocation of resources and priorities. I'm going to turn first to Nick, but then I'd like to pivot back to both John and Norm on this. So we understand the challenges in terms of predictive intelligence. Throughout most of the post-9/11 period, though, one of the primary intelligence resources were focused on terrorism, on combating terrorism, and the resources were abundant. And certainly during that period, virtually no other national security issue rose to the particular level of, in terms of the threat issue and the importance of preventing strategic surprise in that domain. Arguably, this is no longer true. We just heard from D.N.I. Coates. You heard him describe the challenges of cyber. You heard him describe the challenges of North Korea and the nuclear threat. Some now, when you look back at the counterterrorism mission, might argue that we're overinvested, might argue even that we're over-resourced on CT. How does the CT community perhaps deal with shifts in resourcing and the importance of still preventing strategic surprise in this domain, Nick?
Well, and this is something that I was worrying about, kind of starting to worry about every day as I left government service, because this has been a train that has been, you could see coming in the distance for quite some time now. Just what Steve and Director Coates talked about, the idea that for the last 4, 5, 6 years, cyber and other issues have accompanied terrorism in that first couple of paragraphs of the DNI's annual threat testimony, lifting those issues up as they should be lifted up. Even someone in a parochial counterterrorism or terrorism-related position like myself could not argue that those issues weren't pressing their way onto the agenda and should be pressing their way onto the agenda. What has not happened thus far, though, is that it hasn't yet, in my mind, resulted in a pull of resources away from the counterterrorism problem set. That's coming, in my mind, because we just don't have enough blanket to cover all 4 corners of the bed. If you're talking about overhead architecture, to do the kind of overhead collection we do globally, if you're talking about training young analysts to be smart on various topic areas, pick whatever metric that you use to measure IC investment and resources. And the fact is we are having to do more, to cover more, to be aware of more, to prevent strategic surprise across more different vectors than we were just a few years ago. And again, I think we've made enough progress in the fight against global terrorism that I don't mind sharing that center stage with those other issues, because we should. But I worry that over time, if we shift investment away from some of the terrorism discipline, counterterrorism discipline, and underinvest in that, we could find ourselves again facing strategic surprise. It's easy for me to say that. I can't point to when, where, how, where that spot in the world is that problem might emanate from. But it is something that I think our counterterrorism community is going to have to learn how to do, which is to do more with less. And it's not something they've had to do in the period since 9/11, when you could pretty much count on, as Michelle said, the abundancy of resources.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Please.
Because I think this is one of the most difficult and important things you do in the intelligence world. Even though there's a myth that American intelligence can cover everything at all times, and we encourage that myth, it's also true that you have to make choices all the time, and you can't do everything all the time. So it was not uncommon when I was in my last job to pick up the phone and call the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, and say, I really need you to move a destroyer from the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And in my mind, I'm thinking I'm going to possibly miss that missile launch in the Indian Ocean, but I need that collection in the Persian Gulf a little bit more. In other words, you're making a decision that is consciously recognizing that you may fail somewhere in order to succeed somewhere else. And this happens all the time in this business. So you have to constantly be thinking and talk about things the public doesn't understand. That never arises when there's a question of an intelligence failure. So we were accused of having failed to detect the Indian nuclear test in 1998. There's a whole story behind that. But one of the things to realize is that we had actually moved some resources once again to the Persian Gulf rather than the Indian Ocean area. So that happens. So what criteria do you use? Well, I go back to something. I used to take notes when Bob Gates talked, generally. I found that was a good strategy. And I remember on one occasion he drew concentric circles and said, here's how I do it. I put the most important issues in the innermost circle, and then I draw circles out and say these are important but less. Maybe you can think of them as urgent, important, emerging, and maintenance. Okay? Does that make sense? So urgent. What's urgent? Well, things that threaten the lives of Americans or the physical security of our country or our troops in battle. Okay? You got to get those things right. So what's that list? It's sometimes counterterrorism. It's sometimes weapon systems. It's nuclear. It's cyber. So that list's getting longer. And then, to me, the second big circle is big places about which we are not certain that could go bad on us and haven't yet, maybe. Okay, so China's there. You need I don't know whether China's going to be a competitor, adversary, or what. Certainly going to be a competitor. But intelligence needs to have a riveting focus on China. And Russia now, of course, is in that category as well with greater certainty. So one could go on in this way. But the point is, you need to be conscious about your choice of priorities. And then you also have to be flexible because they change often. And so you've got to be able to move things around very quickly.
And this is why the ODNI is critical, because that certainly was the way the world did and should have worked at that time. That's not how the world should work right now. You need to have one place where you have someone who has an exquisite understanding of your GeoInt, your SIGINT, your HUMINT, et cetera, who's got that focal point with the president. That's the DCI, DCIA. That's great. But if it's the DNI, then the DNI's got to make that call. Where you run into a problem is that, let's take the issue of cyber. So the countries that have attacked the United States or ostensibly been involved in attacks in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. You have China, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have North Korea. In order to set up, and maybe others, in order to work that, you need to have 4 or 5 different programs with country-specific specialists. And these people have to be developed and grown. This isn't something you turn on overnight. You can indeed move, as John correctly stated, certain assets quickly. And there's a cost. The second issue we have is when we're at war, that comes at the cost of a lot of intelligence collection in 2 ways. There's no colonel in the world who's defending his forces that can't get enough imagery of his perimeter. If you can get 10 shots a day, you should push for 20. But what really changes? Maybe unsure. But who wants to tell that colonel who's keeping America's treasure safe he can't have 2 or 3 more imagery shots? Well, that comes at the cost of something nearby. And that's a real story. The final comment I would make is when you're thinking about resources and investments, conflicts develop generations of people. It's actually relatively easier to take people who've done counterterrorism, targeters, relational database, thinkers, et cetera, and move them to similar type of topics. Counterintelligence is actually quite close. But if you've spent 2 to 3 tours in a war zone, doing war zone type of issues, which is critical, important, and saves the lives of our soldiers, our soldiers, and et cetera, that's a lot harder to transform into strategic collection issues. So you actually, by building up these programs, you have to figure out how you transform these people. In some cases, you may note, there are a lot of people who joined the IC at 9/11 and left after about 10 years. And they often spent a lot of their time doing heroic actions in war zones, but it's just not their cup of tea to penetrate the Kremlin, to penetrate the Supreme Leader's office, to penetrate Kim Jong-un's office, et cetera, et cetera. No harm, no foul here. So resource development has a long-term tail, and when you make decisions on what to do with policy, you're going to feel it.
So I'm going to pose I'm going to pivot off the issue. You raised 2 issues that are sticking out to me right now, Norm. You raised an issue, of course, organizational structures as a key component for helping to develop competence. You talk about the importance of the DNI. You also talk about the importance of intellectual and human capital in terms of focusing talent priorities on specific areas. I'm curious if I'm going to link, the issues of, let's say, the importance of preventing strategic surprise and also the importance of developing foundational knowledge over time. 2 issues are kind of popping to mind. One is North Korea as a hard target, and in terms of being able to develop the intellectual and human capital, to develop that long-term foundational knowledge on what is arguably one of our hardest intelligence targets, and perhaps juxtapose that with the importance of preventing strategic surprise out of a post-conflict Syria, for example. How would that compare for the intelligence community enterprise being able to organize itself to meet those challenges?
So we had some discussions today about gray zone activity. Mm-hmm. And gray zone activity is nowhere more apparent than in Syria, where the Iranians have established multiple pseudo-forces where you also have terrorist elements still ongoing. You have special forces, U.S. forces there. You have the Russians, the Bolsheviki are there. You have the Syrians themselves, and you have longtime Hezbollah. It's a very challenging environment. Imagine the number of different elements of the intelligence community that work that issue, and to include people doing functional work, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, cyber, counterproliferation. So you have a vast community that is working these issues, touching from Moscow to Tehran to fighters who are going to Libya and perhaps aiming at Tunisia. Tunisia sent more fighters to ISIS than I think any other country, and many of them are going home. And so you have the Sahel to worry about. North Korea seems somehow, as a terrifically hard target, a little more contained in that you don't have quite as many different countries and geographies to worry about. You're at least able to focus on a smaller terrain, and as well as wondering about Chinese views on issues, and working with your colleagues in South Korea, and of course you're worrying about the Russians. That's how I would see that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
John.
I think Syria is the most complex problem we're facing as a nation right now. Norm's given a very good picture of it, so I won't go on about it except to say that all of the problems of the Middle East converge in Syria, and all of the implications of Syria are global. Everything. Why did Brexit occur in the UK? And how did that then impact on the unity of the EU? Probably because of migration from Syria. That isn't true. It's what they thought, though. When I say it's not true, but just that was the impression that was let loose in that referendum. And our leadership in the world will be judged somewhat by our performance in Syria, because at present, the Russians, I think, this is not intelligence, I'm talking more as a foreign policy analyst, the Russians at this point are probably the most influential actor in Syria, along with the Iranians. And we are playing a very small role in the diplomacy. We have a military role working with the Kurds. We've got a little corner of Syria that we have. But a lot will be, the implications of Syria going forward will be enormous. And so intelligence needs to be very focused on telling the policymaker what are the implications long term from Syria. And we could talk more about that. North Korea, you're right. North Korea illustrates the classic dilemma in intelligence as we struggle between understanding of capabilities and intent. We pretty much understand capabilities in North Korea now. Most of it, I'm just looking at open source, okay? I'm not looking at any classified data, but on the basis of open source, I can say with some confidence that the payload they can lift now with their ICBM test vehicle is about 1,000 kilograms, and you only need about 700 kilograms to push up a nuclear weapon. So that's just based on what I read from scientists who are looking at imagery. So intent is harder in North Korea, as it is almost everywhere, and this cuts across, you talk about the challenges, this cuts across so many ways, because today you talked about foundational intelligence. Frankly, I think foundational intelligence, meaning by foundational intelligence, I think we mean what is this country? Who's there? What are the cultural and tribal and sectoral issues there and so forth? That's all pretty easy today. You have the CIA World Fact Book, for God's sake. But you also just, if your homepage is Real Clear World, there's someone writing about all these things every day, or if it's War on the Rocks. Foundational is pretty easy. I recently did a little study of, you're going to think I'm obsessed with World War II, a little study of intelligence in World War II, and one of the principal intelligence officers of that era said, Europe was pretty easy foundationally because we all knew about Europe. No one knew anything about Bataan, Papua New Guinea, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. There was no foundational intelligence at all. When our troops invaded North Africa, this is the first analytic job that the OSS did was, what's the beach like? Who lives there? What do they speak? Okay, we know all of that today. So the foundational issue is much easier because we're living in this information era. my phone's in my pocket. There's my foundational intelligence.
Yeah.
Well,
But intent is as elusive as it ever was. And what this has done is narrow, Steve Aftergood's still here, he might agree with me, it's narrowed the range of things that are really important for the United States to get with its intelligence. And all those things now are harder. The Chinese Politburo doesn't do SIGINT. They have a fleet of trucks to drive around their debates on paper. So who do you want to recruit? Truck driver? Maybe. It's all much harder than it used to be when you're talking about intent in some of these places like North Korea, China, Russia. So that's, I think, where the real crunch is coming in our enterprise.
Thank
Michelle,
you for
let
that.
me
You
follow
wanted
up a
to
little
add.
bit on the foundational intelligence question, because kind of good news, bad news. We're describing a world in which we've got to have foundational intelligence on almost every topic, because almost every region, topic, or conflict zone could produce the surprise event that puts our national security interests at risk. On the other hand, so we in the IC are pretty good at describing how deep the hole is that we live in and why we need more resources to dig our way out of it. But I think what John pointed out is something worth remembering. A lot of that foundational intelligence exists in the open source world right now, and we need not, in my view, spend a whole lot of time investing in capability in that on behalf of the intelligence community. I kind of used to joke when I would read my PDB, I'd see once a year an article, usually timed to the visit of some head of state or something, about the performance of the Slovak economy or the performance of the oil sector in Hungary. Hungary doesn't even have an oil sector. And that told me there's probably an analyst whose job it is to monitor, track, watch, know, live that topic area. And yet, as John pointed out, your iPhone can tell you much, if not most, of what you need to know about issues like that are not necessarily at the crux of our national security set of challenges and dilemmas. So how do you shift the resources away from that to put them on the critical topics where we do have not only comparative advantage, but necessarily some exclusivity in terms of whether the government should be doing this work? And I worry a little bit that we remain a little spread too thinly across the intelligence community enterprise, covering things that are not quite first or second or third tier in terms of their potential existential impact.
I think we do both. We have, to understanding intent, you need to understand decision-making architecture. Unless you have that microphone right next to President Putin that carries around all day, et cetera, et cetera. Have I said too much? Sorry, you're all and everybody else watching this. We've got to take you all out.
He's just dreaming.
I know
He's
he's
dreaming, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm just dreaming. What a
He's
dream.
fantasizing.
What a dream. What a dream. Okay,
But I couldn't possibly comment.
Exactly. But understanding those layers which change and the people around them that move around give you a sense of how information flows to people. So you've heard the White House say that Kim Jong-un may not be receiving appropriate information about the true nature of the horror that is the North Korean economy, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps. But in any case, that tells you something about his structure. And if you understand that structure, you understand the information that's flowing up on certain issues, you can predict how your adversary may respond on certain points, particularly if you've studied him so long and you know the fellow and his clan so well that you see how they behave in similar instances. So there's a case here for subject matter expertise. There's a case here for long-term investment on hard issues. There's a case for, as Nick wisely stated, of making sure that we have not risked that by understanding information that you can pick up somewhere else. And at a southern point, I'd like to talk about Open Source Center. But
yeah, I'm going to actually, that's the next question. I understand the importance of where you are on intentions. Policymakers place a very, very high premium on enemy intentions, adversary intentions. So it's an important thematic. But each of you were talking about sources of information. And so I'd like to pivot a little bit to that and where the intelligence community needs to strike the right balance between traditional sources of intelligence, human, imagery, SIGINT, versus publicly available information, open source information. And I'd like first to go to Nick and then to Norm in terms of how the sources of intelligence have changed, Nick, in terms of counterterrorism mission. I'll turn then to Norm in terms of when you're making judgments on Iran, where were you looking for sources of information, how that has evolved over time? But Nick, if you could address the CT component.
I'd say there's been a pretty dramatic evolution over the last half decade in the counterterrorism world in that we've had to expand our horizons to look at sources of information and intelligence that go well beyond what Michelle described as those traditional sources. I hate to make it sound like in the good old days when all we had to do was worry about Al-Qaeda and getting their email. But there was a period of time where you could, in a sense, spend enormous time and effort trying to penetrate terrorist organizations with human sources, and you could work very hard to capture their email or their telephone conversations with signals intelligence capabilities. And if you did those things successfully, you had a pretty rich picture of the terrorism threat that you were facing, and could then hand that over to the kind of the pointy end of the spear to carry out the kind of effective counterterrorism operations that have kept us safe for most of the time since 9/11. Now the picture is different and harder. All of that work that needs to go on in the HUMINT, SIGINT domains must continue to go on. We still have to work every day to try to penetrate ISIS, to get inside the decision-making structure of an ISIS leadership in Iraq and Syria. But at the same time, we're also dealing with a tremendously a situation in which we are awash in publicly available information that may have intelligence value when it comes to terrorism. And so how do you figure out what is signal and what is noise in that environment? And it also has implications for how you recruit and train analysts as well. It used to be that you could probably go to schools like this and find talented people who have regional studies, area studies, linguistic studies backgrounds, who understand social science, who understand regional conflict around the world, and you could train them in the intelligence skills they need to be good intelligence analysts. We still need to do all of that, but we also now, and you heard Director Coates refer to this, we need data scientists too. We need that data scientist who will sit next to that person who understands the geopolitical dynamics in South Asia, so that he or she can work together to try to piece together the puzzle. And so one of the things I said in public speeches a lot as I was leaving government was I felt like the discipline of intelligence analysis was shifting under our feet literally all the time, and even more so in the last few years. And so as the D&I sits above it all and figures out how do you recruit, train, and resource a system across 16 agencies, he and his colleagues at the D&I have to be mindful of that. It's not just enough to go get the best Russia experts that we can find in grad school, or Iran experts, or North Korea experts. There's a whole lot of other disciplines we need out there. People who probably didn't even imagine a career in the intelligence community or in national security before.
Yeah. Norm, when you're making IC judgments on Iran and other Middle East actors, where did you find yourself looking for the most important information?
Well, first, as the National Intelligence Manager, I did not make judgments on her. I say that with the former head of the NIC here, so he doesn't throw a cup at me.
Sorry, Greg. Sorry about that.
At least I didn't make them in front of the NIC. Can put it that way. So when you collect information on a hard target, Iran or anything else, you have really two issues. The first is there's a stream of data from a variety of sources: SIGINT, HUMINT, OSINT, MASINT, et cetera, GEOINT, et cetera, et cetera. To me, when we needed to come up with what does this mean? The role of the ODNI, which is unique because it's not something that the CIA, and again I'm a CIA officer, would innately do or inherently do as a first step, is to identify who that best expert in the U.S. government may be on this issue. And often that was the NIC. And the national intelligence officers are national treasures. But at the same time, it's often a CIA analyst, an NCTC analyst, a CIA collector, an NSA collector. And they would be the individual, DIA. DIA has some extraordinary capacity, or CENTCOM. And your ability to be able to say, I've got this, where do I go to get the answer that I can put into a briefing point that may augment a PDB, that is going forward in a half an hour, was something that we did routinely in the ODNI. But I think had I been in any one agency, I just would have looked within that agency, and I think you get a broader complexion of data at the ODNI. And, of course, the NIC is always doing its magic.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Because, there are... Because basically, Michelle, what you're talking about here is sources.
Sure.
And how do we know what we know? And maybe speaking to students here, I would say it's time for the exercise of real imagination as we go forward in the future. Now, why do I say that? Well, among our collection methods, there's at least one that is eternal and always will be, and that's HUMINT. Back to biblical times and back further, we will always have and need HUMINT. Nothing beats street knowledge about what's going on in a country, and that's eternal. And that's all there was. If you think about it, let's think about it in a large sweep of time here. Until the mid-19th century, with the invention of the telegraph, that's all there was. But once we started to move information electronically, then the intelligence challenge changed, and we get into the era of SIGINT. And then in the late 1950s, someone says, what if we could take photographs from space? Well, that was a big question then. Now it's nothing. It's on your phone again. So, it's still important, but it's prosaic. One of the issues in the intelligence world now, when you talk to the STEM people, the science and technology people, is the question of phenomenology. Big word, but what it means is, are we extracting all of the data that exists in our technical collection, whether it's radar or infrared imagery from space or whatever? That's one question. The other question is that all there is? Our collection methods are basically from the industrial age and now somewhat post-industrial age as we get into cyber. But is that all there is? When they were asking about imagery in the 50s, that was what we call the paradigm shift question, which means, what is there that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? And that did revolutionize what we do, imagery. It really did. So that's the question we need to be asking in the intelligence field now, primarily among our science and technology people. What is it that if we could do it would revolutionize what we do? Is that all there is? SIGINT, imagery, MASINT, and HUMINT? Is that the end of the story? Is that the end of history in intelligence? I don't think so. But I'm not smart enough to tell you what the next breakthrough will be in intelligence collection, but there will be one. So all of the students, you guys figure that out.
Actually, let's go ahead and pivot to the students and pivot to our audience here and open it up to questions. Before we conclude the symposium, I'll come back to the panel here to get their final thoughts on our panel topic. But let's hear from you and what's on your mind. If I could just ask you to raise your hand and then identify yourself. We're going to go right here. Is it the two who are sitting right here? I'll let you go back to back.
Hi, so I'm Scott Rody. I'm an intel analyst in the Army. My question is pertaining to General Qasem Soleimani, who we know is really influential. And my question is, what makes General Qasem Soleimani so effective in the sense of establishing the U.S. efforts in Iran, Iraq, and the surrounding regions?
Your guy, right?
I would say Norm.
We
Norm.
haven't done anything to stop him. The Quds Force is a unique and malign creature which the international community should not tolerate. It is the only entity on the planet that exists for one purpose, to create militias that are loyal to a particular flavor of Iran's elite, militias that are anti-American and murderous to boot. And the Quds Force, since its inception in 1979, when it began working Kurdish issues, when it was responsible indirectly, but the word responsible is still in the sentence, for the death of American heroes in Iraq and the wounding of American heroes in Iraq and everything else in the region. And until the international community stops this entity, they will continue to be effective. They are an absolute gray zone creature. And we do not do gray zone well,
because it's just not in us to create surrogates. I will close with one question, two quick questions I put forward. If people often talk about a Saudi-Iranian rivalry, name a Saudi proxy group. You can't. Name all the Iranian proxy groups in one breath. You can't. Okay, that's the international community has failed the region in this regard.
Nick, would you like to add to that?
No, I'd only just observe that Norm spent the 30-plus years as an intelligence officer bringing information and analysis to policymakers, and he was denied the opportunity to have a policy view. It's nice to see that he's been liberated from the shackles and can live the life that he's been dying to live.
I kept my mouth shut when the senator was up here, and I could have proposed a large.
But what Norm says is accurate. In some ways, we've lifted this individual up and somehow invested him with almost superhuman powers in terms of his ability to carry out malign activities against U.S. interests, and yet we find ourselves struggling to identify tools that we can use that would actually allow us to solve the problem. And that's been, I think, a policy dilemma for successive administrations.
And as we think gray zone more broadly, should not be a covert issue. It may sound like a great Michael Caine movie that, our guy against his guy. No. This is why God made the international community in an open debate to say, Iran or any other country, you must stop doing this. We do not want a war between our special forces and theirs somewhere in some far dusty field. We want the UN Security Council to say Iran's economy and its leadership will be punished, and therefore foster a debate. Is this who we want to be?
Thank you. The gentleman sitting next to the individual had a question, had their hand up earlier. Did you still have a question? Or was it?
Actually, sir, we were working together with this question, so I was just helping.
So you guys had double head. All right, teamwork. All right, teamwork. That's okay. All right, good. I applaud that. All right, that's all right, so no problem. Let's go with Christy, and then we'll hit the table right here. Thank you.
Thanks. So I want to return to Norm's policy expertise, actually, and ask a question. When Michelle, the panel's about competency in the intelligence community, which is really often determined by, or at least judged by, policymakers.
Yes.
So I'd really be interested in your professional opinion about how you manage the relationship with the policymaker, get close enough to them to understand what they actually really need to enable their decision making, but stay far enough away so you're not somehow sucked into an agenda that you really can't allow that bias to seep into your intelligence analysis.
Two quick comments, and then I will turn it over to John. Obviously, Nick, I have tremendous experience. This one, I always saw it as a failure if a policymaker asked a question for which I wasn't prepared to answer. I saw as my job as the National Intelligence Manager to be so in tune with the various policymakers that I could predict the type of things they would need before they would need them. That was success. The second part of this is when we look at where the intelligence community should go, absolute truth to power, an ability to say something that may not be what they want to hear is something the IC must have, and it has. I've never seen Iran politicized. How people handle the information is a different story, but I've never seen the data politicized by our analysts. They are extraordinary. And I think keeping that is imperative as well. Yeah, I would just add that if you, I agree with Norm completely. The real standard is, can you answer their questions? If you can't, can you narrow the range of uncertainty in the situation they're dealing with, which is what Brent Scowcroft often asks us to do. That was his definition of our role. And the other thing is, it helps to live among them. We had a program which I participated in and many others did, where you go out and become a State Department officer or a Defense Department officer or work at the NSC and see how the material is received, see the questions they're asking, hear their complaints when they've already seen what you've given them in some cable the night before, or when what you've given them is too long and they don't have time to look at it. So I think that's how you serve them. And sometimes when you can't predict the election that they want you to predict, you can certainly tell them what are the underlying forces that are going to determine how whoever is elected deals with the situation they inherit. So I think that's it, and the truth to power piece is very important. I said to someone the other day who was lamenting to me and to a group, oh, the intelligence world is so challenged these days, oh, they were so worried about it. And Steve heard me say this to students this morning. My reaction to them was, no, the intelligence community has power. Yeah. It has the power to tell the truth. Right. It has the power to say what is correct, what is factual here at a time when that's really all in debate in ways that it's never been in debate before. So in a way, that's maybe the most important thing you can do for policymakers right now.
I'm going to break moderator etiquette and just chime in briefly. I think as actually Sherman Kent, again, our father of modern intelligence, has a lot to say on the relationship between the policymaker and intelligence. And there's a debate about how close intelligence should be to the policymakers. Might there be a loss of objectivity? But I think Sherman Kent himself had come down the side that being too distant may actually result in some of the greater challenges, because unless intelligence analysts and those working in service to policymakers understand policymakers and know what their needs are, they're not going to be able to contribute to the most informed national security decisions.
Yeah, and they don't know what their needs are. That's the other thing. It's really, I've always thought of it as a seller-consumer relationship. In other words, to put it in a different context, if you're making cereal or toothpaste, whatever, you've got to present that to the customer in a way. You've got to understand what the customer needs and is looking for, and then you've got to convey it in a way that makes it acceptable, that makes it consumable. The customer doesn't come to you and say, and invent the product. And so the burden here is really on the intelligence officer to take the effort to understand what they need and to get it to them in a form that is useful to them. Because they don't sometimes know what they need, or if you ask them, it's everything.
This is true.
I would chime in that I don't know that you could always find a real sharp, bright dividing line between policy and intelligence on some of the national security issues we face. There's this image some may have of the intelligence community just defining the problem, throwing it over the wall and saying, over to you guys who get paid more and are politicized to figure it out. We're now out of the picture. Tell us how it works out. I didn't feel that way. Certainly on the set of counterterrorism issues I've been involved in for 16, 17 years, we called ourselves a CT community, a counterterrorism community. And as we sat around and went through the intelligence, we then figured out who's got the right tool. Is it an intelligence tool, a diplomatic tool, a military tool, a law enforcement tool? And we were all there, in a sense, trying to come up with good strategy and policy. Now, there has to be analytical integrity, and there's a whole set of mechanisms inside the intelligence community to make sure that analysis isn't tainted or tilted towards a policy outcome. But a lot of the seniors in the intelligence community, I would argue, are participants in the policy process. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's almost a feature of the landscape.
In some cases, if you've done the target long enough, you can sit there and say, I've seen this movie before. Don't open the door. There's somebody with a chainsaw. So that actually, I used to think that's perhaps the most important thing I brought to a meeting, to say, well, you're the third NSC to wonder about this, and the answer is no.
That's right. I remember when Chinese forced a plane down, the EP-3, in 2001 on Hainan Island. The policymakers were sitting around saying, they want us to apologize. We're not going to apologize. How are we going to get out of this mess? And a panelist who was supposed to be here today and couldn't be here put up his hand and said, you don't have to apologize. This was an analyst. He said, just use the word sorry once and find two other places to use the word regret twice. And you don't have to use an apology, and that'll get you through this. So we called it the letter of one sorry and two regrets. We got the plane back. So was that analyst making policy? No. But that analyst was sort of kicking the door open to say, there's a chainsaw behind that door.
Sir, you had your hand up over here.
Hi, yeah. My name's Noah Genovese. I'm lucky enough to be one of the undergraduate fellows here with the Clements Center. And what we've heard a lot today is that we do have this abundance of foundational knowledge thanks to the development of various different innovative technologies. And instead of necessarily needing experts to tell us everything that we need to know on a particular ground, we can just look it up. At the same time, we have authors like Tom Nichols telling us that, in fact, we do have a new epistemological crisis today in the United States. What are the areas in which you would agree with him, saying that, no, in fact, even though we do have foundational knowledge in general, more so today than we did in the past, there still are some areas that we need experts. What would some of those areas be for you today that foundational knowledge is lacking behind?
Around the corner analysis. It's one of the bravest things an analyst can do, and that is to say, this trend line is probably going to lead you here or there. That's something you should rarely undertake, and undertake only in specific circumstances. I think John's probably best positioned to answer this, but I think when it comes to things that we still need to know, they're traditional. Leadership intent, what's that decision-making infrastructure? Will the missile work? Do they really have a bomb? What's the bottom line in the negotiations? Those questions don't really change, but where that data exists is a little different. Now, the trend lines of will the economy survive, what's the unemployment in the country, et cetera, that's where open source data comes in.
The imagination, as John said earlier, to figure out how we collect that.
Yeah.
The questions are not different. How we get to the answer, we probably lack a lot of the imagination right now inside government to figure out what the next int is, or the next source of information.
It's OSINT. I think we don't understand OSINT. When you think of OSINT, you think about it as newspaper articles or television, et cetera, et cetera. That's maybe a little cartoonish. But the DNI, one of the things I would consider is creating an open source enterprise or agent, perhaps even an agency. Because the definition of open source now may be so broad, so vast, that it requires the creation of a type of expertise that needs to feed in on itself and build on itself. And instead, we tend to take open source personnel and we spread them around, generally within the CIA, generally within a couple of other places. And I don't think it allows that heat, that internal combustion to occur and to draw out outside experts such as yourselves. Say, what should open source be? How to use think tanks? How to use the smart people who sat on this stage today to talk about gray zone activity? That's a type of open source intelligence, and it doesn't easily get ingested into the community. So I think open source needs to be relooked at.
Great. The gentleman here in uniform, and then we'll go to the table here.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Ellison from 636 in my battalion. As we have grown out of the solely CT era and are facing more peer and near-peer threats, both conventional and unconventional, that poses not only a problem for the intelligence community, but also for maneuver units as well, as we struggle to, are we going to be facing an insurgent force or a more conventional force? Do you see a benefit in further aligning theater commands and intelligence commands with FORSCOM units so that they can train and be more operationally ready for specific threats in the near-peer as well as the insurgent mode of combat?
Thank you.
If by align you mean co-locate, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but the conviction I have about this may address part of what you're asking, is that when it comes to intelligence support for military activity, virtual presence is no presence. And so I think it's imperative now that we drive physical presence of intelligence officers down as low as we can in the military chain. Typically in a combat situation now, you have a fairly robust intelligence capability at roughly the battalion level. If we can aspire to an objective, drive it down to, at least to the company level. Platoon is probably harder. But yes, this is something we've struggled with. It came into bold relief in the first Gulf War when General Schwarzkopf complained that you have all this stuff up here, but we're not getting it down there. And we've worked hard to fix that over time, and I think we've gotten a lot better. But that's my view. Drive it down physically, drive it down in physical presence as low as we can go.
The combatant commands are aligned well with the strategic analytic resources. So I think, in addition to John, who's hit it from one end, I'd hit it from the other and say, I think we have the strategic alignment where it should be. The interaction between the combatant commanders and the J2s and the J2 staffs is really very good across the board. But we need to do, as John has correctly put, as always, we need to do more, and I think in that direction than on the strategic side.
Okay. Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is investment you can't make at game time because by then it's too late. Those patterns of cooperation and those relationships need to have been created in the months and ideally years leading up to game time when that peer-to-peer conflict, reveals itself.
One of the things we have to worry about now is if effort and priority moves away from the CT arena, that we not lose this beautiful thing we've achieved. As I remember at the beginning of the 9/11 era, we were not very good at aligning our military, particularly our special operations forces, with our intelligence capability. And now that's a unique and beautiful thing that the United States has. Among the advantages we have, that's one of them.
And Stan McChrystal and Bill McRaven deserve tremendous credit for making that happen.
Yep, and it would be terrible to lose that as we diminish our emphasis on CT. So someone has to be thinking about how to preserve that. And we have a whole generation of intelligence officers, for better or for worse, socialized in war. Right. I mean, the first time since World War II.
Or Vietnam.
Well, Vietnam, yes, Vietnam, right, exactly, Vietnam, yep, exactly.
All right, I'm going to turn right over here. You had your hand up here in the green. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Ritchie, and I am the graduate assistant at the Clements Center and a first-year graduate student at the LBJ School. I really appreciate the conversation that we've had today about capabilities and intents of our adversaries, and I think that having that perspective is really important. And I think that D&I Coates did a great job of reminding us that it's also important to assess our own. So something that I'm interested in hearing your perspective about is the structure of our IC, and more broadly our national security apparatus, and whether or not that structure allows us to address emerging threats well. Specifically kind of looking at this new era of cyber threats and looking at how we've had to somewhat reorganize or at least restructure the way we address counterterrorism in the past couple of decades. Are we going to have to do the same to address cyber threats? And if so, what would that realignment look like?
I think we've done it. The DNI has formed the National Cyber Threat Information Center. There's a mission manager for cyber. All agencies and entities, NCTC and CPC, the counterproliferation geniuses, who are also very important on this, and I think we should always keep counterproliferation as a huge issue out there. They are rowing very closely together. Now, how do you then transform that part of the IC to build your cyber program on Iran, China, Russia, Lebanese Hezbollah, terrorist groups, et cetera, that's an architectural resource issue that will not be easily solved. But I've seen firsthand that the intelligence community not only takes this seriously, but has made some really good progress in that regard.
Here's the thing I wrote down from what Director Coates said that struck me as sort of the novel, useful idea that, am I still on, that would go forward. When he said there's a struggle yet for us to understand the relationship between offense and defense, I think that's at the heart of our cyber problem, and I'll tell you why. So we get a cyber attack, and everyone says, well, let's take what the Russians have been doing, and everyone says, of course, we don't know exactly everything our government is doing, I don't, but everyone says, well, why don't we punch back? There's things we could do to them. We don't understand how escalation works. This is something we spent decades figuring out on nuclear weaponry, through arms control negotiations and the development of strategic thinking. We used to call the people who did this the Wizards of Armageddon. They're all retired now, but my point here is we don't know what happens in that escalatory chain. If you attack in a way that you think is proportional, do they come back at you and do something more, and then do you go back at them? And where does that stop? And we don't understand. We don't have the practice. We don't have the body of experience yet to know that.
And I don't think we want to move in that direction for all the reasons John has stated. A lot of the countries don't care about what we do in their regard. The answer is if a country like North Korea or Russia or Iran hits us with a cyber attack, the answer should not be that we crawl back through a pipeline and take out 3 of their banks, which we could easily do, and a lot more. The answer should be that we stand up very loudly and crush part of their economy in a way that provokes a debate within the Kremlin or wherever to say, is this really the smartest thing to do? Because if you have mid-level officers sort of sending artillery rounds of cyber against each other, that's where that escalatory ladder gets a little squirrely very quickly. So where I think we have a problem, just to build on John's excellent comments, is we actually haven't developed a policy to say that when the Iranians hit our financial sector, well, where's the payment? What did we do back? And we shouldn't say we're going to take out a bank. The answer should be to say they're not allowed to ship oil for a month. Have a conversation in Tehran to see if that was something you want to do. I think that's the failure here. It's not the IC. It's the policy on an asymmetric, unconventional response option program in another area.
I want to broaden out the answer to Kelsey's question beyond the IC to the larger question of the national security community, and are we organized in a way that allows us to respond with maximum effectiveness, optimal effectiveness to the range of threats we've talked about today? And I think the answer has to be no. I don't have a cookie-cutter solution that says, okay, if you just did away with the process as most of us veterans of it understand it, the principals committee meeting with the deputies committee meeting, feeding it, the policy coordinating committee structure underneath it, time-tested, multiple administrations across time have pursued roughly the same structure. But time and time again, I think I've seen now in recent years that it makes us less agile and nimble than we need to be to make the kinds of decisions in real time that Norm just described. Because the generation of the options that Norm just described might take multiple meetings at a medium level of seniority, 3-4 weeks of development, then leading to the next level, then leading to the next level, then getting it to the president as a decision maker. And by then, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months might have passed since the aggrieving act taken by the Iranians.
And no response may provoke a second act because they'll say, apparently that wasn't a red line. I can go a little beyond that. In gray zone world terminology, the rheostat hand always moves very, very fast with the adversary, but it moves very slowly.
And everybody inside that system I just described is working a 14-hour day. It's not as if people are cutting off work at 5 and saying, I've got to get to my Pilates class. But just the way the structure has operated has not allowed us to be as agile and nimble when operational decisions are required. And it's something that White Houses are sensitive about because they don't want to be seen as creating obstacles to effective reaction to national security threats. On the other hand, they feel uncomfortable delegating those kinds of responses to decision makers at operational agencies because then the risk is all borne by the White House, but not the ability to kind of be the rheostat. So I don't have an answer. But this is exactly the kind of work that should be going on inside students of the national security community, how to architect a system that can do the same kind of deliberate decision-making structures you want, but in a real-time world where information is flowing far faster, where threats are materializing far more quickly than they ever have before. And that's a next-generation problem that I think you, who are in school now, are going to be dealing with for a long time.
I think, sir, I'm going to have you have the final question over here, and then if we've got like 2 or 3 minutes at the end, I'd like to get any final thoughts from our panelists.
Jim Cragen, St. Mary's, San Antonio. As an old ambassador in many decades foreign service, much of it in Latin America, my question is, what about transnational threats? What about the bad stuff coming up here and the undermining of societies in Latin America and close to us? So it's a little different focus, but maybe we can just do a few words on that.
Thank you, sir.
I could say a quick couple of words on that. I think one of my colleagues at the National Counterterrorism Center had a gentleman named Russ Travers had responsibility for this set of issues, the transnational organized crime set of issues, as part of his portfolio across a number of different assignments. And the thing I always took away from my conversations with him is that we talk a fairly good game, but we have underinvested as an intelligence community and as a policy community in really understanding those issues and devoting the same kind of resources to them that we devote to more traditional threats. It's understandable why that is so, but it goes back to what I said earlier. You can't close that gap overnight. Clearly, this president has placed an incredible premium on making sure that the national security community reacts to those issues. And so I think there's some catch-up work to be done inside the intel community to make sure that we can do what John has told us we need to do, provide the kind of decision advantage that good intelligence analysis provides. We're playing catch-up. We are not where we need to be on organized crime around the world, particularly in Latin America, the way we are on terrorist networks around the world.
You know, there's a hackneyed phrase I'm going to use here because it's so hackneyed that when I say it, everyone will say, yeah, right. You need a whole government approach. That's the hackneyed phrase. Now, I've seen this work, though, when it really works. And in the Latin American arena, the example I would cite is Colombia. That was a whole-of-government effort by the United States to work with the Colombian government. I've been down there within the last 2 years and had been there in the 12 years ago when we started what we called Plan Colombia. Point is, we had a couple of very excellent ambassadors there with large missions who coordinated every aspect of the U.S. government, from the Coast Guard to the I guess we can say the CIA was there, yes, and to various other military components and DIA and so forth, and orchestrated it in a way that really made a difference in Colombia on the narcotics problem and the terrorism problem, and also came away from it with a good relationship with Colombia. I mean, a good partnership. It's a place in the world that ought to be a model for how you can help a country deal with a problem and not turn that country against you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I'd like to just have our panelists, any final thoughts that you have in terms of competence? I think competence good and necessary.
Yeah. We're still in favor.
And we could certainly look at perhaps where we might be at great at risk for the intelligence community undermining competence long term.
I worry about technology. Yeah. Technology covers so many broad areas. It's not just cyber. It's the speed by which information is transforming societies in Latin America and the Middle East. It's the speed by which weapons of mass destruction are now made more precise and survivable. It's the speed by which so many different things are done, offense and defense, how regimes will respond to this in other places, and how we will have to follow this. This requires a new type of technical, political competence among analysts and collectors. It requires a new type of regime. And I think where we did great work on this for years was actually in our counterproliferation department, because they had to follow these sorts of things and did it brilliantly. And I think we somehow need to get ahead of that, because if we don't, that leads to your cyber 9/11. That leads to your collapse of societies because of the speed of social media.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick.
Related to Norm's point, when I stepped down from government, the regrets I had were not about we didn't get this terrorist or stop that group or finish off Al-Qaeda or any of those substantive things. Most of the regrets I had about things left undone surrounded workforce development, IT infrastructure investment, things that were going to have to be foundational for, we've used the word foundational way too much in this conversation, but things that are going to have to set us up to deal with whatever the terrorism problem is 5 or 8 or 12 or 15 years from now. And so I think that's true in the counterterrorism world. I'm sure it's true in other parts of the intelligence enterprise, and it gets to Norm's point about technology. If we don't figure out how to make capable the next generation of intelligence officers and find the right tools to give them, then just hiring smart people won't be sufficient to the task. And so that talent, that human capital development has to be married with a strategy to give them the technical tools, the technological tools to deal with a very different world than the world that John, Norm, and I served in during our careers. And so that's the kind of the nagging part of the job that I kind of look back on and say, I wish I'd made more progress on that.
I agree with everything that Norm and my other colleague have said. So there's no point in me repeating what Nick and Norm have said. But what I would do is put it in the broader context of what intelligence is here to do, which is, as I said earlier, to help the United States navigate in a difficult world, and make the point that I think this is a world we've never navigated in before. So I think the challenge, and why do I say that? Because it looks like previous worlds in some ways, but you'd have to go to the interwar period between World War I and World War II to find a time when there was so little restraining powers in the world from doing what they want to do. And U.S. leadership is under challenge. For a long time, we were the orchestra leader, and I think we are not in many cases now, and so there is no orchestra leader. And there are those who wish to replace us. But none of them would lead the world with the same mixture of self-interest and universal values that the United States has always pursued, not always perfectly. And so we're in a, for lack of a better term, a kind of balance of power world in which we don't have much practice at that. So the real job for intelligence now is to help our policymakers understand that world and to see the areas of advantage and leverage as they go forward. And their job in many respects is harder than ours, because I think somehow the intelligence community self-generates competence.
It endures.
It hires smart people. Smart people have resources. The mission is clear. There's always room for improvement. There's always the aspiration for consistent excellence. We always have pockets of excellence. The aspiration is for consistent excellence. But I think our policymakers are going to need more from us than they ever have in my lifetime anyway.
Thank you very much. And that, I think, Steve, I will turn the reins back over to you. So thank you for the opportunity to be here.